Progressive Action in Regressive Times is the name of the Humanists of Florida 2004 conference here in Tampa, Florida. I'm Ed Golly, and we are pleased to be joined by the Reverend Barry W. Lynn, Executive Director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Barry, welcome to the set. We're pleased to have you.
Thank you.
We always think you have it backwards. State is always more important than church, but we'll deal with that today. Tell us a little about yourself, who you are, and how you came to be the executive director of this national organization.
All right. Well, I know I'm down here, of course, for a humanist conference, and the ministers at humanist conferences are about as rare as weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But I always like to come to these events because the truth of the matter is there is common need and a common purpose, whether you're a believer or a non-believer in matters of religion, that we need to keep a decent distance between the institutions of government and those of religion. So I was selected as the executive director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State 12 years ago, but the organization is about 52 years old, founded in the end of the 1940s by people representing a number of religious traditions as well as journalists who were then concerned, as many of us still are, about issues like the takeover of education by religious groups. At that time, the activities were frankly most common in the Roman Catholic Church, trying to seize control of public schools. Now we see the same thing going on with fundamentalist evangelical Protestants trying to take over the public schools. The issues don't change much, Ed, over the years, and in fact the founder of Americans United, Glenn Archer, was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's. And Eleanor Roosevelt said to him once, you know, we have to fight these battles in every generation all over again, and sadly that's turned out to be the truth.
But the battles may be the toughest now because you claim that we now live in the worst of times for those who have any concerns about civil rights, civil liberties, and state-church separation. In fact, you call this the most frightening time you've witnessed in your 55 years. Can you expand about these concerns that you have?
I don't think we've ever seen a time when religious fundamentalists have been so close to capturing control of the United States government and turning it into a theocracy, a government run along their narrow religious lines. The President of the United States, of course, is literally calling the religious right rather than having the religious right call him to get direction about the kinds of policies our country ought to undertake. The Congress is led by people who are frankly also deeply committed to a religious right agenda. You've got Tom DeLay, who basically calls the shots in the House of Representatives, a former pest control company president from Texas, who says he does not believe in evolution, as if that's a matter of belief instead of scientifically valid evidence. And of course, Bill Frist over in the United States Senate has been labeled as a true blue friend by the Family Research Council, one of the most aggressive religious right lobbying groups in Congress. Sometimes people say about him, well, he must be okay. I mean, after all, he's a doctor. But sometimes I ask him to think Dr. Strangelove. And the court, which of course this administration wants to pack with ideological conservatives of the farthest right kind, is just 1 or 2 votes away from being able to overturn important decisions in church-state, as well as to overturn Roe versus Wade and return America to the dark ages of reproductive freedom.
The Patriot Act. I actually know people who claim that they really are unconcerned about it because they're not Arabic, so they don't really see this as affecting them or their civil rights, since they're not going to be the ones who are arrested, jailed, or investigated. In fact, they think the Patriot Act is serving to make them safer because it's going to target people who are of foreign nationalities posing a potential threat to our country. Can you talk to that for us, Barry?
You know, the USA Patriot Act, and what is worse, some of the things that the President would like to add to it, concern and should concern every American interested in his or her own personal privacy. I mean, there are provisions in the Patriot Act that allow for the government, on the basis of really no evidence whatsoever, no probable cause, no particular evidence that they can present, to get records of what you take out of the library, what books you buy in bookstores. These are things that have become so outrageous for so many, even conservatives, that some of the conservative members of Congress are calling for the repeal of individual sections of that act. And even when the government goes after things like the records of Islamic charities looking for possible terrorist connections, can you imagine what would happen if this were done of Christian charities, some of which, shall we say, haven't had the perfectly clean record in the past? But it would be an outrage. And of course, the loss of liberty, as you know, Ed, often occurs first among those that have the least popular views. But then, once the government has the power to search, to seize records, to scrutinize your life, they turn it on the next group, and finally all Americans find that Big Brother is literally in their bedroom, their kitchen, and every place else in their house.
But then the organizations in this country, such as yours, Americans United, the ACLU, are organizations whose focus is on maintaining civil liberties. And the amazing thing to me about it is that civil liberties are possibly the most cherished aspect of our Constitution, our form of government. Why is it then that so many Americans hold in such high contempt the type of organizations that are devoted to protecting our civil liberties?
You know, it really is shocking that civil liberties, which of course are protected by the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights is a pretty conservative document. It protects the rights of the people against the otherwise overarching power of government or of majorities to dictate what we are able to think about religion, what we're able to do about religion, what we're able to read and print. So there really are some conservatives, to their credit, who might be social conservatives on some issues, or fiscal conservatives, but who recognize that the intrusiveness of the Patriot Act makes them, in some cases, even join organizations like Americans United and like the ACLU in larger numbers now than ever before, because they're starting to see that if you truly are a conservative, you want to conserve basic principles. Those basic principles are where? In the Constitution of the United States of America.
But then okay, in keeping with that point, the Constitution is there to protect us from the intrusions on our civil liberties, and yet it seems that the government that we have in power now is just steamrolling a lot of those civil liberties. So many Americans seem to be misled into thinking our nation's a democracy, and whatever the majority wants that you've been referring to is what they should have, regardless of what protections are really in the Constitution. Now, is that the fault of self-serving politicians who just ignore the Constitution, or is it a shortcoming of an educational system that doesn't really familiarize Americans with what their Constitution is intended to do for us?
You know, there's a lot of blame to go around. The truth of the matter is that pandering by politicians has gotten worse and worse and worse in the decades that I've been in Washington. You know, after the controversial, but I think absolutely correct decision by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that the Pledge of Allegiance should not contain the words "under God," the most dangerous place in Washington to be was between a politician and a television camera, because they were all rushing in front of any camera they could find to say, no, we like "Under God," and in fact, we can probably sing a couple stanzas of "God Bless America." So they do pander to this notion that they have to support the majoritarian religious view in order to keep elected. Now, I have to say, too, that public schools are often under such pressure, particularly by religious right groups, that they don't always teach about the Constitution. They really don't talk about how individual people, religious, non-religious, have been able to go to the United States Supreme Court in the past and defend their rights, including their rights to be different. So the public school system is under pressure. Don't teach sex education, don't teach, heaven's sakes, evolution, and don't even teach an honest history of our country.
Well, you brought up the case of Michael Newdow that's going to be heard now before the Supreme Court on March 24th. If he prevails and the court finds that the two words "under God" is in fact unconstitutional, can this pave the way for organizations like yours to pursue other remedies against, for example, the religious graffiti on our currency or our national motto, changed from "E pluribus unum" into "In God We Trust"?
I do think that Michael Newdow is going to win this case before the United States Supreme Court, and at least, at a minimum, uphold the decision for those Western states affected and included in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I think, frankly, he could easily get 5 votes and win this for all Americans around the country. I do think that this does not necessarily mean that every aspect of what you've referred to as religious graffiti. I think sociologists have a somewhat a little more sophisticated way to call. They now refer to it as ceremonial deism, but it's the same thing. It's just these references to a generic God. I'm not sure I know who believes in a generic God. I think most of us who believe in God are more specific about it. But the truth is that this will not necessarily mean that there can never be a religious phrase on coins, but it will mean that when you have young people in a public school being told by an authority figure, this is the time now to pledge allegiance, and that pledge is a religious test, not a political test, but a religious loyalty oath every day, that is going to be constitutionally forbidden. So it will set the record straight. It would be a right thing for the Supreme Court to do, but I wouldn't count on them immediately deciding that In God We Trust should go back off the coins, even though, of course, most Americans believe it was always there. The truth is it didn't appear on any coins until the 2-cent piece was issued following the Civil War. So like many other myths, the myth of In God We Trust as a permanent part of our money is just bogus. By the way, if just being close to some kind of a religious phrase made us a religious people, the mere fact that we have Gideon Bibles in motel nightstands would have stopped adultery by now, and it hasn't.
Speaking of mythology, I remember when the Newdow case was first heard and decided by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, there was sort of an outpouring, especially on a lot of the conservative talk shows, both on radio and television, that this country was founded in Christian principles, and that these 10 commandments, I guess maybe referring also to the Judge Moore case, are the basis of the laws that we have, the democracy that we have. The very structure of our country couldn't exist in its present form without the full influence of Christianity.
The truth is this is not a Christian nation. It's not just that I don't think it was founded as a Christian nation. The historical record is absolutely clear, and Washington and Adams and early presidents made those specific kinds of statements. The Declaration of Independence does talk about nature's God, but that has nothing to do with the construction of God as a Jerry Falwell or a Pat Robertson would talk about God today. These were people who at most were deists. That was the clear majority sentiment of the people who both signed the Declaration of Independence and later crafted what has been called a godless constitution. That is to say, our original Constitution has only one reference to religion, and that is that there shall be no religious test for public office. Beyond that, there's no reference to God. That was quite deliberate because this was founded as a secular republic, that is, a government to be run along secular principles, not anyone's particular religious views, including those of Christians.
Another myth we hear is that, well, actually it's not a myth, it's truth. There is no phrase in our Constitution that establishes a wall of separation. But of course the First Amendment does define the Establishment Clause, I guess is what we call it. And as I understand it, Jefferson, who was sort of influential in the founding of the country and the Constitution, defined this to his letter to the Danbury Baptists. This is really a legitimate expression that we can use to really define the role of religion and government and how the two should stay separate, even though it doesn't appear in the Constitution. Isn't that right?
There are a lot of phrases that don't appear in the Constitution, but where the idea is absolutely a bedrock principle. Separation of church and state, admittedly, isn't there, but 16 words are that say Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Other ideas that we have that people assume are in the Constitution, separation of powers, the fact that the courts do some things, legislatures do things, that's not in the Constitution either. A fair trial. Everyone thinks that's in the Constitution, but it's not. It's just a shorthand phrase of reflecting what a set of articles of the Constitution Constitution talk about. So it is clear to me that Jefferson meant it when he said it. Jefferson, of course, one of the grandfathers, along with Madison, of the construct of religious freedom in our country for believers and non-believers, described this in a letter to the Danbury Baptists as a wall of separation between church and state, mirroring, some historians think, Roger Williams, the great advocate for religious freedom, who used to talk about a separation between the state, and he called it a hedge of separation between the wilderness of the world and the power of the church. So this is a phrase that was actually present in colonial times in a slightly modified form, and is very much a part of the principles and history of our country.
Speaking of founding fathers, how do you think they would react to a lot of the issues that we see unfolding in that arena today, the arena of civil liberties and government funding of faith-based organizations and so on?
Yeah, I think the founding fathers, after they had picked themselves up after fainting, for the kinds of outlandish things the president says and does, and John Ashcroft, the attorney general, says and does, they would say, listen, we founded this country on the basis that everyone is equal, that you don't have to be religious, that you don't have to take oaths of office, that you don't have religious ceremonies, as John Ashcroft does, prayer sessions in his office for his employees every morning. I think they'd say, take that to a Starbucks. Don't use government property, and don't put people who don't share the religious beliefs of John Ashcroft feeling uncomfortable if they don't attend his religious services every morning. So I think they'd be deeply shocked when the President of the United States has a faith-based initiative, government-funded religion of the ministries and missions of churches, and then actually gives a speech, as he did recently, in which he said, we're going to give money to fund programs that save Americans one soul at a time. Sorry, but the President of the United States is not our theologian-in-chief. He is the commander-in-chief. He's the president, the chief executive. We didn't elect him to be our pastor, even if we're religious.
Right, and of course in his State of the Union address just recently given, he called for $300 million to be spent on faith-based rehabilitation for people coming out of the prison systems. Does this mean, I'm sorry, what I should say is, does he even have the slightest comprehension of what our Constitution is all about when he calls for things like this?
I honestly don't think that President Bush actually knows what the separation of church and state means. I don't think he has the construction. If the speechwriters didn't occasionally throw it into a speech, I don't think he'd ever mention it at all. This idea of giving hundreds of millions of dollars to faith-based organizations, and now even faith-based prisons. Of course, Floridians know that you now have an entirely faith-based prison in Lottie here in Florida, and it's no more constitutionally permissible to set up a faith-based prison than it would be to set up a faith-based housing project or a faith-based post office. And of course, we have actually asked the state of Florida to turn over a vast number of documents to try to find out if Florida's taxpayers are basically being forced to put money in the collection plate for someone else's religious conversion. Jeb Bush, along with, of course, his brother, frequently talk about salvation coming only from Jesus Christ, and of course they have every right as Americans to believe it, but as public officials they certainly do not have any right to ask the rest of us, believers or not, to pay for their religious ideas.
In case you've just joined us, I'm Ed Golly at the Atheist Forum, and we're talking today with Barry Lynn, Executive Director of an organization called the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, headquartered in Washington, D.C. We're talking about the erosion of civil liberties in America as a result of various things such as the Patriot Act and other concerns that have evolved with this particular administration. Taking a sort of a religious bent and handing our tax dollars over to religious organizations, faith-based initiatives, and so on. Barry?
One of the things that happens literally every day, there is a major church-state issue that arises someplace in the country, and we have a staff, a growing staff of over 30 people now in Washington who work on and help our chapters, of which we have 11 actually in the state of Florida, to get involved at the local level and the national level on these important issues. We were one of the organizations that represented several of the attorneys in Alabama who challenged the placement of that 2.5-ton granite monument by Judge Roy Moore. I should correct that, former Judge Moore, because he has been suspended, and frankly, I hope he is disbarred from the continued practice of law in the state of Alabama. He had absolute contempt for the Constitution. He took this 2.5-ton monument, put it in the judicial building as Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, and then defied a federal court order to have it removed. Petty tyrants, along with mighty ones, really need to be told the truth about the Constitution. Eventually, of course, that monument was removed. The irony of this, and this is one of the things that I think is an embarrassment, frankly, to those of us who are believers. There's something like 245 churches in the near proximity to the courthouse that contained this 2.5-ton monument. Not a one of them said, well, why don't you put it on public display here on our front lawn? Because rather than battle about the display of religious icons and statements on public spaces, why don't those organizations set up to promote the faith, why don't they just promote it in their own way on their own private property? It really is an embarrassment.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of Judge Moore, it seems to me one of the most dangerous things that a president can do is to appoint judges to the federal bench and to the Supreme Court that are going to rule against the protections that we have in the Constitution. Now, let me ask you this. You think Judge Moore could ever find a place on the Supreme Court?
You know, I've got to tell you, I do have some optimistic streaks, and ultimately I think as bad as these times are, that in the long run, justice is going to prevail. And justice means increased awareness of the individual rights of people. You have some rough spots, and we have had them throughout American history. Judges are definitely a problem. I mean, many of the people who are being appointed by this president are people who have a limited amount of respect for the United States Constitution, but they're largely unknown. 98 to 99 actually % of the judges that have been proposed have already been confirmed by the Senate. A couple of them have been the subject of filibusters. More should be. The Attorney General of Alabama, who by the way is not a hero, it took him so long, to straddle the fence on what he was actually going to say about the Judge Moore case. I thought his pants might split, and he's not a hero, but now he's being suggested for a federal appeals court in one of the circuits in the country that's been most engaged in civil rights litigation over the past few decades. He should not be confirmed. Judge Janice Rogers Brown, another person who is a complete conservative extremist, who doesn't even know that the Bill of Rights necessarily should apply to the states, even though, of course, we passed the 14th Amendment after the Civil War to do that, and even, I think, Judge Scalia believes that, but she doesn't. I don't think that these people should be on the bench, the federal judiciary, and in fact I think it's perfectly fine for them to be filibustered as a matter of principle.
I want to talk a little about school vouchers. I know that you're familiar with the issue here in Florida, but before we get to that, just a few days ago the U.S. Senate approved the country's first federally funded educational voucher program in Washington, D.C., which will enable some poor public school students in the District of Columbia to attend private schools. Now, with that decision, is this beginning to pave the way for national acceptance of school vouchers in all 50 states?
Interestingly, public opinion polls show less support now than ever for school vouchers because as people start to look at the evidence from places like Florida, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Cleveland, Ohio, places that have had these programs for a number of years, they find out not only does it end up diverting tax dollars into the coffers of religious schools and away from public schools, but it doesn't even work. The program does not make education better for the students who take the vouchers. In fact, in some areas in Cleveland, after extensive study, voucher students, that is students who left the public school and go to private schools, are doing worse than their counterparts in the public schools. If you want to do something for education, we've got to fully fund public education. And divesting public schools of some of their resources and converting it into dollars for private religious schools is bad constitutionally. And frankly, a lot of state constitutions are clearer than the federal Constitution about this. And that's why, even though the United States Supreme Court, in a very controversial decision by a 5-4 margin, upheld the constitutionality, the permissibility of vouchers under some circumstances, virtually no states have passed new voucher programs, and both the state of Florida and the state of Colorado, relying on state constitutional provisions, have turned thumbs down to voucher programs in those two states. So the public is not enthralled with this. This is an ideological snake oil solution to the real needs of school children. If we want to compete with countries around the world in the future and with the future of our kids, we better reform public schools, not try to tear them down by sending a fraction of those students into voucherized, predominantly religious schools.
But then how would you respond to a tax-paying parent's argument that might sound something like this? I pay taxes to support the schools. Why shouldn't I have the freedom to direct that money to the school of my choice for my child?
You know, and it's an argument I do hear a lot. The truth of the matter is, though, in the United States, most public schools are paid for not by the parents of any student. In other words, most of the money that goes into the school system in most places, say here in Florida, is from people who have no children, people who have no children in schools, grandparents. I mean, these are not funded one-on-one on the basis of if you have a child of school age, you pay the taxes. You pay only a fraction of it. We don't have a system where if you don't like something, you just don't have to pay for it. In other words, there are plenty of people who don't like the war in Iraq. That doesn't mean they can't pay their taxes because some fraction of it might be used for that purpose. I think what America really needs is a guarantee, and we certainly haven't seen it, not with this phony No Child Left Behind Act, which is mainly an excuse for no child being allowed to exist in the country untested any time that's appropriate for all the educational testing companies. But we need a real commitment to divert whatever number of dollars are necessary to make sure that every child in America gets a quality public education. If you want a private education, you're certainly entitled under our Constitution to go to a private school. You are not entitled to ask for the government, however, to subsidize that private school. If you don't like the police department in town, I may get in trouble here because I don't know the local laws in Florida, but most states you can go out and buy a gun. If you think that will protect yourself, that doesn't mean the government has to provide you with that extra protection.
I have a little trouble understanding something that's going on here in Florida. Maybe you can help me with it. As you know, we started the voucher program in '99. It was immediately challenged in court, and the judge found that the Constitution of our state prohibits the expenditure of any public funds for religious purposes. Therefore, he concluded that the voucher program was unconstitutional. It didn't stop. The governor, instead of, well, what I think would have been a gesture of respect for the law and the judiciary, decided to not only keep the program going but expand it pending the appeals and overturning it or just appealing it. Shouldn't he have gone the other way with that and stopped the program until it was found constitutional?
You know, I think that governors and politicians that buy into any program, including something like vouchers, tend to want to preserve the fiction that they could never possibly make a mistake. As a consequence, they're going to keep the program even if we should, under, shall we say, a test of rationality, you stop the program and see what happens in the later decisions of the court. But many politicians don't do that, and of course the courts are kind of creaky here and everywhere else. They operate slowly. There's sometimes the sentiment that, well, you know, parents or students have built up some expectation that they now have a voucher and they want to be able to keep it, so we'll let them have it until we see how this works through the court system. But I think that is doing business backward. Of course, in Florida, so many people who initially got vouchers found that the private schools were not a fit for their children, that within about 2 months of starting the program, something like a quarter of the students actually dropped out of those private schools for which they had gotten a subsidy, and went back, of course, guess where? To the public schools, which do, of course, have a requirement constitutionally to take all comers, to take all kids who need and who certainly benefit from an education.
Politics in America seems to follow sort of a swinging pendulum agenda. The right wing gets in power, and then the left wing gets in power, and it seems to move back and forth. My concern is some of these issues that are actually causing the erosion of our civil liberties, or the government's support of religion, being entrenched in a way that we can't reverse out of that, such as when Reagan appointed an ambassador to the Vatican. That ambassadorship has never been dissolved when a Democratic president came in power. What do you see as the future of some of these different issues that are coming into play now on the American agenda as being difficult or impossible to reverse down the road?
You know, it's certainly going to be difficult to change some of what could happen if you had a judiciary that, for example, did overturn Roe versus Wade. What would happen? Well, of course, then you'd have to go back to the states and state by state battle to preserve the right of privacy, the right of women to make reproductive choices. You'd go back to a fundamental, though, Ed, and I do believe this. You know, laws are laws. They're important. Decisions of courts are vitally important. But ultimately, these principles, like equal justice under law or privacy or freedom of religion, reside in the hearts of people. And when it dies there, then we are in genuine trouble. We're in a little trouble, of course, if Congress passes bad laws, if those laws are upheld by courts, that's even worse. But ultimately, we've got to get serious about having a desire to have a country that celebrates the diversity that's here. This is a mosaic of over 2,000 different religions and perhaps 20 million free thinkers, agnostics, humanists, non-believers, whatever, however one wants to characterize themselves. These are our neighbors, our co-workers, the people we work with every day. And I think that America is way ahead of politicians in our willingness to accept the diversity that's truly representative of this country. I really wish, you know, as we enter another political season, Ed, that more people, including in the press, this is not just a problem in the public, but the press ought to be satisfied when you ask a candidate, what's your religious background? And the candidate says, religion is personal, I don't want to talk about it. That should be enough. Unfortunately, now we see not only George Bush wearing religion on his sleeve, both sleeves every day, talking about religion. Many of the contenders for the Democratic nomination also talk about religion, sometimes wading into the waters of shark-infested theological foolishness, as I've sometimes said. Here we've got Howard Dean announcing that his favorite book in the New Testament is Job, which of course is in the Old Testament. And we find, of course, that earlier President Bush, the first President Bush, once read a speech in which he talked about one of his favorite Bible passages, John 16:3. Which of course reversed John 3:16, which of course many people hold up at football games. So I mean, once you wade into these waters, Ed, you at least better know what you're talking about. Or even if you are a sincerely religious person, you look like you're not. You look like you're simply pandering to people because you want their votes. And I think it made tremendous sense for Article 6 of the Constitution to say there shall be no religious test for public office. The President of the United States has said he won't appoint judges who don't believe our rights come from God. That should immediately have caused everybody in the Senate to say, well, send us some people who have secular qualifications, not religious ones. But even when the Democrats controlled the Senate, they didn't do that.
Barry Lynn, if you were giving the State of Union address instead of President Bush, what do you suppose it might sound like?
You mean that would be after I would fall, or get up after fainting, because I know, to my knowledge, I'm not even running for public office. But I think the State of the Union, when it comes to the Constitution, is certainly grimmer than I've seen it in my lifetime of 55 years.
Wow.
I think the politicians are pandering so much to the 18 to 20% of the electorate that self-defines itself as evangelical conservative voters that they really are trampling upon, or at least talking about trampling upon, the rights of the rest of Americans. I'd say the State of the Union is still strong if we're talking about people, and if we're talking about a willingness of people to think through issues and to be rational about what they're doing. But when you find these politicians pandering to that important special interest core of 18% of these born-again conservative, politically conservative voters, it does skew elections. It helps to define, for example, what happens in Republican Party primaries, because the Republican Party, which some have referred to as an appendage of the Christian right rather than the other way around, frankly, this was a very calculated decision. They could have used another party. They chose the Republican Party and now have effectively converted it into a promoter of their version of family values, which, to me is not my version of family values. Family values to me means you don't cut the social safety net in the country, you don't shred the right of people to have health care, but all of these things seem to be happening, and in exchange for it, the President, as he did in the State of the Union address, doesn't talk about all the budget cuts for social programs. He just talks about dumping a little money in the collection plate of a church and making everybody feel better because of it. That's fundamentally wrong, fundamentally immoral in the wealthiest country ever to exist in the history of this planet.
Yeah, now some of the recent actions by this president, such as his stand on illegal alien workers or his borrow and spend policies and the deficits he's building up, would probably normally alienate the right-wing voter. But he can get away with these things because, as I see it, they virtually have no other place to go. What percentage of the voting population do you think he has in his pocket, no matter what he does?
I think that Karl Rove, the, of course, close advisor to the president, well, I got in a little trouble recently because Pat Robertson, of course, announced on January the 2nd that he had had a conversation with God, which he interpreted as meaning that George Bush would be elected, quote, in a landslide. So now God is now handicapping, not just picking, but handicapping elections. And of course that led to a lot of rude comments from people, including wondering why Pat Robertson, when he ran for president himself back in 1988, hadn't checked in with God first, knowing that he would lose. But I just said, when the Associated Press called me, I said, look, I think it's possible that Pat Robertson was talking to Karl Rove and merely thought he was talking to God. And it got me in a little bit of trouble. But I think that when you look at this, the president does have, and Karl Rove wants, to maintain this base of 18 to 20% of self-described Christian conservative voters, and to get 2 to 4 million more of them, Karl said this himself, out to the polls to re-elect the president. Now, you know what? In America, the truth is you can vote for people on any basis at all. You can vote because of their religion or their shoe size or their favorite movie of all time. But I'd like to think that Americans, in fact, do something different. And that is they listen to the answers. What is the policy of this president going to be? And make a decision based on how much that reflects their view of everything from economics to foreign policy to the U.S. Constitution and the kind of judges we'll have to interpret that Constitution.
Sounds like you'd like to take a quick break, maybe get a little tea. Joe, have you thought of any questions? I'm down to one more.
No,
Nothing?
He hadn't hit all the bases that I could do.
The last thing I want to do then is just wrap up with our show and ask you.
I never plugged.
Okay.
Tape to speed.
Barry, our program is called the Atheist Forum, and so it would be natural, of course, for viewers to think that we're extremely hostile toward any mingling of government and religion. But this also affects the religionists in our audience and in our country. When government is intruded upon by religion, it really affects the freedom of religion for all Americans. Talk a little bit about why religionists should be so concerned about this.
One of the things that the Constitution does is guarantee not only that government isn't going to make theological judgments, but also that the government won't intrude in those religious matters where government has no business. That if people want to operate a faith-based institution to serve their community, they have a right to do that without undue regulation. They don't get special rights, but they certainly get the rights to practice and exercise their religion. Whenever government starts to fund the ministries, for example, of some someplace anywhere in this country, you better believe that sooner or later federal regulations will come along with it. Of course, taxpayer oversight requires the scrutiny of the books, the records, the methodologies. And frankly, many religious groups, conservative as well as liberal ones, say, look, we don't want to take any government money because we don't want the strings that are attached. Why? Because the strings could strangle the vitality of the very programs that we're running. The other thing that religion supporters need to understand is that when the federal government starts having approved religion lists, you may be on it this year, you may be taken off of it next year. I was absolutely shocked when the president announced and had his Office of Faith-Based Initiatives near the White House say that they never met any pagans who had any social interest, and of course, therefore, they're not going to be getting any of this faith-based money. Earlier, they had said that the Nation of Islam, obviously too hateful to ever get any money. We can have our personal views about pagans, Methodists, atheists, anybody we want, but for the federal government to decide that some religions are too hateful or not sensitive enough, and to put it on a list to make them eligible for federal grants is absolutely a violation of Constitutional Law 101. But another sad example that this administration seems literally to be hostile to the very notion of separation of church and state, apparently not understanding that it does protect the church as well as whatever integrity is left in the state. Americans United, you know, is open to and loves to have more and more people who support our ideas from across the political spectrum. We've got Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Greens. We have no partisan involvement. We are equal opportunity attackers whenever anyone in any political party violates the principle of church-state separation. We don't hold back. If it's somebody who is of one party or another party, we criticize them. Our website is www.au.org. You can get all kinds of information about the many legal cases we're involved in, as we challenge, for example, a faith-based unit in an Iowa prison, as we challenge other displays of the Ten Commandments on public property in places like Washington State and the state of Maryland. And also to get information about our monthly magazine, Church and State, which is used by virtually every progressive group in this country to keep up to date, very much up to date on church-state issues as they happen all over the country. These are some of the tools that we use. We've also started to sponsor a daily radio program that's heard live in Los Angeles and on the internet at www.cultureshocks.com. That's another way to get out progressive ideas even in these most regressive of times.
And of course, you're celebrating now 11 years as the executive director of this organization.
Yes, I've gotten a few extra gray hairs over the tenure of my time at Americans United, but I'm about to enter now my 12th year, and this has been certainly one of the most important, absolutely the most important part of my entire professional career, because I think it's so important that this principle of church-state separation prevail in this country. It's probably the greatest single idea that this country has presented to the world as a matter of intellectual contribution. And we got it right over 200 years ago. I hope we don't get it wrong 200 years later.
Well, Barry Lynn, on behalf of Atheists of Florida and the whole staff of the Atheist Forum, I sure want to thank you for appearing on our program.
It's been a delight.